In the unforgiving Colorado mountains, Daniel Cross had become a ghost among men. 7 mail-order brides had fled his isolated cabin, unable to bear the silence, the cold, the brutal loneliness. When the 8th woman arrived through a blizzard that should have killed her, Daniel expected nothing, just another countdown to abandonment. But Mara Velasquez didn't scream, didn't cry. She looked at the frozen wasteland and smiled. Something was different this time, something dangerous. Because hope, Daniel knew, was the cruelest lie the mountain could tell. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon shouldn't have made it. Daniel Cross stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the contraption lurch through snowdrifts that came up past the wheels. The horses were foaming at the mouth, their breath coming in ragged clouds that froze before dissipating. The driver, some fool from Denver who'd taken the broker's money, looked like he'd seen death and decided to race it anyway. Behind Daniel, the cabin creaked. Wind found every gap in the logs, every crack he hadn't sealed properly, because what was the point? He'd sealed them for Anna, then for Rebecca, then for the others whose names blurred together now like watercolors left in the rain. The wagon stopped 30 yards out, too far for the driver to risk coming closer in this weather. Smart man. Daniel pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist. February in the Rockies didn't forgive, didn't negotiate. His boots punched through the snow's crust with each step, and by the time he reached the wagon, his beard was white with frost. "You Cross?" the driver shouted over the wind. "Yeah. Got your delivery." The man's laugh was bitter. "Good luck with this one." Daniel didn't respond. The driver had probably heard the stories. Hell, half of Colorado probably knew about Daniel Cross and his revolving door of brides. The man who couldn't keep a woman to save his life. Literally. The wagon's back canvas flap moved, and a hand appeared. Small. Brown. Steady, despite the cold. Then she emerged. Daniel had stopped expecting anything specific years ago. The first bride had been blonde and terrified. The third had been tall and angry. The 5th had cried before even seeing the cabin. But this woman, Mara, according to the broker's letter he'd barely read, this woman looked at the mountain like it was a puzzle to solve, not a sentence to serve. She was smaller than he'd expected. Maybe 5'4", with black hair pulled back tight and dark eyes that didn't flinch when the wind tried to blind her. Her dress was practical, thick wool, no foolish lace or ribbon. Her coat was patched at the elbows. She carried one bag, and it didn't look heavy. "You're Daniel," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. I'm Mara Velasquez." She pronounced it the Spanish way, the Z soft. "We should get inside before your driver freezes to death." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He practically threw her bag into the snow and started turning the wagon before Mara had fully dismounted. "Hey," Daniel called out. "The payment." "Broker already paid me double," the driver shouted back. "Said I'd earned it if I actually got her here alive." The wagon disappeared into the white curtain of falling snow, and then they were alone. Mara picked up her bag without waiting for help. "The cabin's that way?" Daniel nodded, too surprised to speak. She started walking, and he followed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The other women had needed coaxing, reassurance, lies about how it wasn't as bad as it looked, how spring would come soon, how they'd manage. Mara didn't ask for any of that. Inside, the cabin looked worse than usual. Daniel saw it through her eyes now. The single room with its crooked table, the bed that sagged in the middle, the stove that worked but smoked when the wind came from the north. Traps hung on the walls next to snowshoes and a rifle that needed cleaning. The whole place smelled like smoke and unwashed man and loneliness. Mara set her bag down near the stove and started unbuttoning her coat. "It's not much," Daniel said, hating how the words sounded. Apologetic. Weak. "It has walls and a roof." She hung her coat on a nail by the door. Underneath, her dress was simple, dark blue, no decoration. "How many winters have you survived here?" 8? "Then it's enough." She walked to the stove, opened it, checked the wood supply stacked beside it. "You keep this going all night?" "Have to. Temperature drops to 20 below, sometimes worse." "Show me how much wood to use." "Not a request." not a demand, just a statement of what needed to happen next. Daniel found himself moving, demonstrating, explaining things he'd never had to explain before because the other women had either refused to touch the stove or had done it wrong and filled the cabin with smoke. Mara watched, nodded, asked precise questions. "The damper sticks sometimes," he said, showing her. "You have to jiggle it twice, then pull steady." She did it herself, and the damper opened smoothly. "Like the pump at the boarding house in Denver." "You came from Denver?" "Texas originally, but I've been in Denver 3 months, working at the boarding house." She closed the stove and turned to face him fully for the first time. "The broker said you've had other wives." There it was. Daniel waited for the rest. The accusation, the fear, the dawning realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. 7, he said. "They all left." "Why?" "Too isolated, too cold, too quiet. Take your pick." Mara walked to the window, looked out at the wall of white. "How long did they stay?" "Longest was 6 weeks. Shortest was 3 days." "The one who stayed 6 weeks? What broke her?" Daniel thought back. Ellen. She'd lasted until a storm trapped them inside for 5 days straight. No sound but the wind and their own breathing. She'd started crying on day 3 and never really stopped. "The silence," he said. "She said it was like being buried alive." Mara nodded slowly. "And the others?" "One hated the cold. One missed civilization, stores, people, church. One thought I'd have neighbors. One said I was too rough around the edges." He paused. "One said I scared her, though I never laid a hand on her. And one just left in the middle of the night. Took the emergency supplies and walked out. Found her 2 miles down the trail, half frozen. Got her to the trading post in time." He expected judgment. Pity, maybe. Instead, Mara turned from the window and started unpacking her bag. "I don't scare easy," she said, pulling out a spare dress, undergarments, a small wooden box. "I don't need people around to feel alive, and I've worked harder than this for less." She set the wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside were sewing supplies, needles, thread, small scissors. "What I need to know is if you're going to hurt me." The question was so direct it knocked the air from Daniel's lungs. "No," he said. "Never." "You drink?" "Not anymore." "Hit the last ones?" "Never. I swear on—" He stopped. What did he have to swear on? "I swear on this mountain. I never touched them. Never would." Mara studied him, and Daniel felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She was looking for lies, and he had none to give, just the truth of what he was. A man who tried 7 times to not be alone and failed every single time. "Okay," she said finally, "then we'll figure out the rest." That night, Daniel gave her the bed and took the floor near the stove. It wasn't chivalry exactly, more like survival instinct. The other brides had demanded the bed, and he'd slept on the floor anyway because their crying kept him awake. At least this way, he'd chosen it. But Mara didn't cry. She lay still, breathing steady, and Daniel found himself listening for the sounds he'd grown accustomed to: sobbing, whispered prayers, the rustle of someone packing to leave. Instead, there was just the wind and the fire, and the creaking of logs settling under the weight of snow. "Daniel?" Her voice cut through the darkness. "Yeah?" "Tomorrow I'll need to see the whole property. Water source, food storage, everything. It's still storming. Then the day after, I need to know what we're working with." "We." She'd said, "we." Daniel closed his eyes and tried not to let that word mean anything. Tried not to let hope crack through the ice he'd built around himself. Because hope was dangerous. Hope was what made the failures hurt. But sleep came easier that night than it had in months. Morning brought a break in the storm. Not sunshine, the sun was a memory this time of year, but a pause in the snowfall and a break in the wind that made visibility possible. Mara was up before Daniel, which should have been impossible. He'd trained himself to wake at first light, a habit born from checking traps and maintaining a fire that couldn't go out. But when he opened his eyes, she was already dressed, her hair braided tight, stoking the stove with the exact amount of wood he'd shown her. "Coffee?" she asked. "You found it?" "Smelled it. Figured it was in the tin by the stove. She poured water from the bucket into the battered pot. This water clean? Yeah, spring-fed. Doesn't freeze all the way, even in deep winter. Good. She set the pot on the stove. After this, show me everything. They drank the coffee in silence, bitter and strong, the way Daniel had learned to make it because weak coffee was a waste of precious beans. Mara didn't complain about the taste, didn't ask for sugar or milk he didn't have, just drank it and waited. Outside, the world was a study in white and gray. The storm had dumped another foot overnight, burying the path Daniel had cleared yesterday. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a frozen cathedral, indifferent and eternal. How much land? Mara asked. 160 acres, claimed it 5 years ago. Most of it's too steep to use, but there's a good valley down that way. He pointed east. Creek runs through it. That's where I trap mostly. Show me the creek. They walked, Daniel breaking trail, Mara following in his footsteps. Her boots were good, not new, but well maintained. She moved carefully, testing her weight before committing to each step. Smart. The creek was half frozen, dark water running fast in the middle where ice couldn't quite grip. Daniel had built a small dam downstream to create a pool for water collection. This runs year-round? Mara asked. Yeah, fed by snowmelt higher up. Never seen it dry. She knelt by the edge, studying the flow. Could support fish? Maybe. Never tried. In spring, we should. She stood, brushing snow from her knees. What else? He showed her the root cellar, dug into the hillside, reinforced with logs, stocked with what remained of last fall's supplies. Potatoes, mostly. Some carrots, dried meat hanging from hooks. It wasn't much, and it wouldn't last past March without restocking. Mara counted everything, didn't write it down, but Daniel could see her calculating, planning. We'll need more, she said. This won't make it to spring thaw. I know. There's a trading post 10 miles south. I go every 3 weeks when weather permits. When's the next trip? Week and a half. I'll go with you. Daniel started to argue. The trip was brutal, the trail dangerous, but stopped. Mara wasn't asking permission, she was stating fact. They continued the tour. The smokehouse, empty now. The woodshed, half full. The area where he kept the traps when not in use, a tangle of metal and chain that had fed him through 7 winters and 7 failed marriages. You hunt too? Mara asked. Some, mostly trap. Pelts bring better money than meat. What about the rifle? For emergencies, an elk, if I get lucky. You get lucky often? Not with elk, not with much else either. The words came out harder than he'd meant them, edged with bitterness. But Mara just nodded like he'd given her useful information rather than a confession of failure. Back at the cabin, she took off her coat and immediately started reorganizing. Not dramatically, just small adjustments. Moving the water bucket closer to the stove, shifting the table to get better light from the window, taking down traps from one wall to make space for her sewing supplies. You mind? She asked, holding a trap. No. Do what you need. By midday, the cabin felt different. Not transformed, it was still the same rough space with the same rough furniture, but more deliberate. Less like a place where a man waited to die, and more like a place where people might actually live. Mara found the holes in Daniel's spare coat and set to mending them without being asked. Her stitches were small and even, the work of someone who'd been sewing since childhood. You're good at that, Daniel said. My mother taught me. Said a woman who could mend could survive anything. She bit off the thread. She was wrong about a lot, but not that. Where's your mother now? Dead? 8 years. Mara started on the next tier. Fever took her. Took my father, too, a year later. After that, it was just me and my brother. Where's your brother? California. Went for the gold that wasn't there, stayed for a girl who was. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Last letter said they're happy. I hope that's true. Daniel waited for more, but Mara returned to her sewing. He recognized the door closing, the conversation ending. He'd done it enough himself. That afternoon, he checked his trap lines while Mara stayed at the cabin. He half expected to return and find her gone, the cabin empty except for a note of apology. But when he came back, 3 rabbits and a fox, she was there. and the stew she'd made from the root cellar vegetables smelled better than anything he'd cooked in years. "You added something," he said, smelling herbs he didn't recognize. "Found them in your supplies. Old, but still good." She ladled stew into bowls. "You didn't know you had them?" "Probably from one of the others. They brought things sometimes. I never used them." They ate in silence, but it was different from the silence with the other women. Not awkward or tense, just quiet. "Tomorrow," Mara said, setting down her empty bowl, "teach me the traps." "Why?" "Because if something happens to you, I need to know how to survive." Daniel wanted to argue that nothing would happen, but they both knew that was a lie. The mountain killed people. It had killed the prospector who'd claimed this land before Daniel. It had nearly killed Daniel himself, twice. Mara wasn't being morbid, she was being practical. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." The next week passed in a rhythm Daniel had never experienced before. Not the forced domesticity of his previous attempts at marriage, with their stilted conversations and obvious counting of days until escape. This was something else, a partnership built on necessity and unexpected compatibility. Mara learned the traps faster than Daniel expected. She wasn't squeamish about the blood or the death. When a rabbit screamed in a snare, she dispatched it cleanly and without hesitation. When a trap caught a young fox barely old enough to have left its mother, she insisted they release it. "It's money," Daniel argued. "It's a baby," Mara countered. "And the pelt's not worth much anyway. Let it grow." They let it grow. She mended his gear, the snowshoes with their broken lacing, the pack with its torn seam, the gloves he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. In exchange, he taught her to read the weather, to recognize the signs of a coming storm in the way the wind shifted and the clouds moved. "See how they're stacking up?" he said, pointing at the darkening sky. "Means snow tonight. Probably heavy." "How long do we have?" "Few hours. Maybe less." They secured everything, brought in extra wood, filled water buckets, checked that the shutters were solid. By the time the first flakes fell, they were ready. The storm lasted 3 days. Daniel waited for Mara to break. This was the test that had destroyed Ellen and 2 others, being trapped inside with nothing but each other and the howling wind. The cabin shrank in a storm, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering, until it felt like being buried alive in a coffin of logs. But Mara didn't break. She sewed. She organized supplies. She told stories about Texas, about dust storms that turned day into night, about scorpions in shoes and rattlesnakes under porches, about a cousin who'd tried to ride a longhorn on a dare and broken 3 ribs. "Dumbest thing I ever saw," she said, and Daniel found himself almost smiling. On the second day, when the wind was worst and the cabin shook hard enough to make him worry about the roof, Mara started teaching herself to carve. She found Daniel's spare knife and a piece of wood and worked at it with the concentration of someone solving a difficult problem. "What are you making?" Daniel asked. "Don't know yet." She turned the wood, studying it. "Feels like it wants to be a bird, maybe." "Wood doesn't want things." "Sure it does. You just have to listen." On the 3rd day, the wind finally stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, so absolute it hurt. Daniel had learned to hate this moment, the transition from storm to stillness when there was nothing to hide behind, no excuse for not talking. But Mara just stood and stretched. "We should dig out the door." They spent the afternoon clearing snow, working side by side. The drifts had buried the cabin almost to the roofline on the north side. By the time they finished, both were exhausted, sweating despite the cold. Inside, Mara made coffee and they sat at the table, too tired to do anything else. "You handled that better than I expected," Daniel said. "The storm?" "Yeah." Mara shrugged. "I've been through worse. Worse than 3 days trapped in a 1-room cabin? I spent 2 months in a boarding house room smaller than this with 5 other women. At least here I can breathe without smelling someone else's perfume." She sipped her coffee. "And you're quiet. That helps." "The others said I was too quiet." "The others were wrong." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Mara saved him from figuring it out by standing and returning to her carving. The piece of wood was starting to look like a bird now, rough still, but recognizable. A crow, maybe. Or a raven. That night, For the first time since Mara had arrived, Daniel allowed himself to think the word that had been circling his mind like a wolf around a campfire. Maybe. The trip to the trading post came on a clear, cold day when the temperature never rose above zero. Daniel had made the journey alone for years, but with Mara along, he noticed things he'd stopped seeing. How beautiful the snow was in morning light. How the mountains looked like they were holding up the sky. How quiet didn't have to mean lonely. The trading post was run by a man named Hartwell, who'd been taking Daniel's pelts and selling him supplies for 6 years. He was a fair dealer, which in the mountains meant he'd only rob you a little bit. Hartwell's eyes widened when they walked in together. "Daniel Cross," he said, "and I see you've got another—" He stopped himself. "Ma'am." "Mara Velasquez." She didn't offer her hand. "We need supplies." While Daniel negotiated prices for his pelts, Mara walked the store, selecting items with the same careful precision she'd brought to everything else. Not the cheapest options, but not the most expensive either. Practical. Sustainable. "She seems different," Hartwell said quietly while Mara was out of earshot. "Yeah." "How long's she been up there?" "Couple weeks." "Huh." Hartwell counted out money for the pelts. "The last one made it, 6 weeks?" "About that." "Well," Hartwell glanced at Mara, who was examining bags of flour. "Maybe this one's got more sand." They loaded the supplies: flour, cornmeal, coffee, salt, sugar, a few luxuries Mara insisted on paying for with money she'd brought from Denver. Then they started back, the pack heavy on Daniel's shoulders, the sun already sinking behind the peaks. Halfway home, they ran into trouble. The trail narrowed where it crossed a steep slope, and the recent snow had made it unstable. Daniel went first, testing each step, and he was almost across when he heard the crack. Not loud, just a small sound, like ice breaking on a pond. "Don't move," he said to Mara. "What? Don't move." But it was too late. The slope gave way with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the world was sliding. Daniel threw himself backward, hit the ground hard, felt the pack pull him toward the edge. His fingers scrabbled for purchase, found a tree root, held on while tons of snow roared past him into the ravine below. When the rumble stopped, he was hanging half off the trail, pack dragging him down. The root the only thing between him and a 100-foot fall. "Daniel!" Mara's voice, sharp with something that might have been fear. "I'm okay. Don't come closer. The whole slope is unstable." "Can you climb back up?" "If I drop the pack." "Then drop it. It's all our supplies." "I don't care about the supplies." But Daniel did. Those supplies meant the difference between making it through winter and starving. He started pulling himself up, using the root as leverage, muscles screaming. The pack pulled at him, threatened to drag him backwards. He got one leg onto solid ground, then the other, and then the root broke. Daniel started to slide, and there was nothing to grab, nothing to stop him from following the avalanche down. His mind went cold and clear. This is how it ends. Not with Mara leaving, but with him dying and leaving her alone. Then something caught his wrist, hard, painful. Mara had him. She'd tied a rope around her waist. Where had she gotten the rope? And anchored herself to a tree. She'd thrown herself flat on the snow and caught his wrist with both hands, and now she was pulling, straining, refusing to let go even though he had to outweigh her by 70 pounds. "Let go of the pack!" she screamed. Daniel's fingers wouldn't work, wouldn't open. The pack was survival, was food, was life. "Daniel, let go or we both die." Her voice cut through the panic. He opened his hands. The pack fell away, tumbling into the ravine, and suddenly he was lighter. Mara pulled, he scrambled, and then he was on solid ground, rolling away from the edge, breathing hard, his heart trying to pound through his ribs. They lay there in the snow, both gasping. "You tied yourself to a tree," Daniel said finally. "Of course I did. I'm not an idiot." "You could have died. So could you." Mara sat up, her face flushed from exertion and cold. "And I'm not staying in that cabin alone all winter, so next time drop the damn pack." Daniel started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sound felt rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. Mara stared at him like he'd lost his mind, which made him laugh harder. "What's funny?" she demanded. "You, yelling at me for almost dying, like I did it on purpose." It's not funny. No, Daniel agreed, getting to his feet. It's really not. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open in his chest, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt something other than numb acceptance of whatever came next. They made it back to the cabin as the sun set. Without the supplies, they'd have to be more careful, ration what they had. The winter would be harder now, but Daniel found he didn't mind as much as he should have. That night, Mara finished carving her bird. She set it on the table between them, a raven, wings spread, caught in the moment of taking flight. "For you," she said, "for not dying today." Daniel picked it up carefully. The wood was smooth, the details fine despite her inexperience. It was the first gift anyone had given him in longer than he could remember. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. Outside, the wind picked up again, bringing more snow. But inside, by the light of the fire, with the raven on the table between them, Daniel Cross allowed himself to feel something he'd sworn off years ago. Not hope, exactly. Not yet, but the possibility of hope. And that was enough for now. The loss of the supplies changed things in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. Not worse, exactly, just different. They rationed everything now. Coffee became a once-a-day luxury instead of twice. Flour was measured carefully, each cup accounted for. The dried meat had to last until Daniel could trap enough to replace it, which meant smaller portions and going to bed with stomachs that weren't quite full. Mara never complained. Not once. Instead, she got creative. She found wild onions buried under the snow near the creek, their tops barely visible. She showed Daniel how to make the flour stretch further by adding ground acorns, bitter but edible once you leached them right. She took the rabbit pelts he'd been planning to sell and turned them into mittens lined with the scraps of an old blanket. "You're good at making do," Daniel said one morning, watching her stitch. "Had to be." Mara didn't look up from her work. "After my parents died, it was make do or starve. Pride doesn't fill your belly." "No, it doesn't." "You ever go hungry, Daniel?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about lying, about maintaining whatever image of competence he'd managed to project. But Mara had saved his life on that trail. That bought honesty. "Yeah," he said. "First winter up here, I didn't trap enough. Didn't know the land yet. February, I was eating bark soup and praying for spring." "You make it through alone?" "Hartwell fronted me supplies. Said I could pay him back in pelts when I got my feet under me. Took 2 years, but I did." Mara nodded, setting down her sewing. "People surprise you sometimes. Not often, but sometimes." "You surprise me." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel felt exposed again, like she could see past the silence and the isolation to whatever was left underneath. "How?" she asked. "You're still here." "It's been 3 weeks, Daniel. That's not exactly a record." "It is for me." Something flickered across her face. Not pity, but something close to understanding. She picked up her sewing again. "Well, we'll see how you feel when it's been 3 months." The way she said it, like 3 months was a given, not a maybe, made Daniel's chest tight. That afternoon, he checked the northern trap line while Mara worked on turning their dwindling potato supply into something edible. The traps had been good to him lately. 2 rabbits, a marten with a pelt that would fetch decent money. He was resetting the last trap when he heard voices. Voices. Up here. In February. Daniel grabbed his rifle and moved toward the sound, staying low. The mountain didn't forgive carelessness, and unexpected visitors were rarely good news. 2 men emerged from the trees leading a mule loaded with gear. Prospectors from the look of them. Young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of optimism that only came from not knowing better yet. "Hey there!" the taller one called out, raising a hand. "Didn't mean to startle you." Daniel lowered the rifle but didn't set it down. "You're on private land." "Ah, hell, sorry about that." The man's accent was Eastern, maybe Boston. "We're just passing through, heard there might be color in the upper creek beds." "There's not." "You sure?" "Because we heard." "I'm sure." Daniel gestured west with the rifle barrel. "Mining claims are that direction. 5 miles. This land's claimed for homesteading." The shorter man, barely old enough to shave, looked disappointed. "We've been walking for 2 days." "Then you've got 5 more miles to walk." The taller one studied Daniel with the kind of assessment that made Daniel's grip tighten on the rifle. You up here alone? No. Huh. Heard about you. Daniel Cross, right? The guy who can't keep a wife. Daniel's jaw clenched. Keep walking. Whoa. Easy. No offense meant. But the man was grinning, enjoying himself. Just curious how number 8 is working out. She run off yet, or are you keeping her locked up this time? The shorter one laughed nervously. Come on, James. Let's just go. In a minute. James took a step closer. See, we're curious. Because we heard this one's Mexican, and we were thinking maybe she'd be more accommodating than the others, if the price was right. Daniel had the rifle up before the sentence finished. Not aimed at the man, not exactly, just ready. Get off my land. Jesus. The shorter one grabbed James's arm. He's serious, let's go. James held up his hand, still grinning. Relax, friend, just making conversation. Now. They left, the mule's hoofbeats fading into the trees. Daniel stood there until the sound disappeared completely, his heart pounding, the rifle shaking slightly in his hands. Not from fear, from rage. He'd heard the talk before, knew what people said about him, about the women who came and went. But hearing someone talk about Mara like that, like she was property, like she could be bought, made him want to put a bullet in the tree those men had just passed. He forced himself to breathe, forced his hands to steady. Then he finished resetting the trap and headed home, moving faster than usual. Mara was outside when he got back, hanging laundry that would freeze before it dried, but would at least air out. She took one look at his face and set down the shirt she was holding. What happened? Prospectors, on the northern boundary. And, Daniel told her. All of it, including the part that made his throat tight with anger. Mara listened without interrupting, her face carefully blank. When he finished, she picked up the shirt and went back to hanging it. Mara, I've heard worse, she said. Men like that, they think certain women are available just for asking, or taking. She pinned the shirt to the line. What matters is what you did. I ran them off. Good. If they come back, then we'll deal with it. She turned to face him. But Daniel, you can't shoot every man who says something stupid about me. You'd run out of bullets. I can try. The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. I appreciate the thought, but I've been dealing with men like that since I was 13. I'm not fragile. I know you're not. Then stop looking at me like I'm about to shatter. Daniel realized he was doing exactly that, staring at her like she was made of glass instead of the same stubborn steel that had kept her alive through everything she'd survived. He looked away, embarrassed. Sorry. Don't be sorry, just trust that I can handle myself. She finished with the laundry and wiped her hands on her apron. Now come inside, I made something that's almost bread. It was almost bread, flat, dense, more like hardtack than anything you'd want to eat, but it filled the stomach. They ate it with the last of the preserved berries Mara had found in the root cellar, forgotten by one of the previous wives. This is Ellen's work, Mara said, examining the jar. She labeled everything. Yeah, she was organized. What was she like? Daniel thought about Ellen, blonde, nervous, always moving like she couldn't stand to be still. Scared. Of everything. The mountain, the quiet, me. She tried to hide it, but I could see it. Why'd she come if she was that scared? Same reason most of them came. No better options back east. Broker probably made it sound better than it was, and he paused. I probably made it sound better than it was, too. Did you lie to them? No, but I didn't tell them everything either. Daniel pushed the berries around his plate. First few, I thought if I could just get them here, they'd adjust. See that it wasn't so bad. But each one that left, I told the next one a little more. By the 7th, I was pretty much listing all the reasons not to come. What did you tell me? Nothing. The broker handled it. I barely read his letter. Mara was quiet for a moment. So you'd given up? Yeah. On what? The mountain? Marriage? Both, everything. Daniel set down his fork. I figured number 8 would leave like the rest, and then I'd stop trying. Live up here alone until the mountain killed me or I got too old to survive winters. That's a bleak plan. It was realistic. Bleak and realistic aren't the same thing. Mara stood, collecting the plates. You're not dead yet. Neither am I. So maybe save the eulogy for when one of us actually dies. That night, Daniel lay on his bedroll near the stove and listened to Mara breathe. The rhythm was steady, untroubled, no crying, no tossing and turning, just sleep, deep and genuine. He thought about the prospectors, about what would have happened if they'd come while he was out on the trap lines and Mara had been here alone. The thought made his hands clench into fists. "You awake?" Mara's voice cut through the darkness. "Yeah." "You're thinking about those men." "How'd you know?" "Because you're breathing like you want to fight someone." Fabric rustled as she shifted in the bed. "Daniel, I meant what I said. I can handle myself." "I know." "Do you?" "Because you've been wound tight as a spring since you got back." Daniel stared at the ceiling beams. "In Texas, did men bother you like that?" "Sometimes." "What'd you do?" "Depends. Sometimes I ignored them. Sometimes I told them off. Once I broke a man's nose with a cast iron skillet. Despite everything, Daniel almost smiled. "He deserve it?" "He put his hands on my friend, so yeah, he deserved it." She paused. "Point is, I'm not helpless, and I'm not going to live scared of what might happen. Done enough of that already. I just don't want—" "I know what you don't want, but you can't protect me from everything. Best you can do is teach me to protect myself." Daniel thought about that. "You want to learn to shoot?" "Already know how. My father taught me, but I wouldn't mind practicing with your rifle. Make sure I remember." "Tomorrow then, if the weather holds." "Good." Silence settled again, but it felt different now, less heavy. "Daniel?" Mara said. "Yeah?" "Thank you for running them off." "You just said—" "I know what I said, but it still meant something, that you did it." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Eventually, Mara's breathing evened out again into sleep. But Daniel stayed awake a while longer, thinking about cast iron skillets and broken noses, and a woman who wouldn't live scared. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of day where the air hurt your lungs if you breathed too deep. Daniel took Mara up to a flat area behind the cabin where he'd set up a rough shooting range. Logs stacked at various distances, targets carved into their faces. "Show me what you remember," he said, handing her the rifle. Mara checked the chamber, checked the sight, settled the stock against her shoulder with the comfort of long practice. She took her time, breathing steady, and then fired. The bullet hit dead center on the closest target. "Not bad for Rusty," Daniel said. "I wasn't aiming for that one." Mara fired again, and the second target, 30 yards further, sprouted a hole just left of center. Daniel whistled low. "Your father teach you that?" "My father taught me not to waste bullets. After he died, I taught myself the rest." She worked the bolt, chambered another round. "Men leave you alone when they know you can shoot." She fired 4 more times, each shot better than the last. By the end, Daniel was pretty sure Mara was a better shot than he was, and he'd been hunting these mountains for 8 years. "You don't need practice," he said when she handed back the rifle. "No, but you needed to see I could handle it." She was right. He had needed that. Needed to know that if something happened, if those prospectors came back or someone else decided to cause trouble, Mara could defend herself. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable quiet. The sun was bright enough to make the snow sparkle, and for once the wind was still. It was the kind of day that made you forget how brutal the mountain could be, how it could kill you with a storm or a fall or simple, grinding cold. "Daniel?" Mara said as they reached the cabin. "Yeah?" "I think we need to talk about something." The words made Daniel's stomach drop. This was it. This was when she'd say she'd changed her mind, that she was leaving when the trail cleared in spring. He'd been waiting for it, bracing for it. "All right," he said, keeping his voice level. Mara sat on the porch step, and Daniel sat beside her, leaving space between them. She didn't look at him, just stared out at the mountains. "I need to know what you want from this," she said finally. "From what?" "This. Us. The marriage." She turned to face him. "Because I've been here almost a month, and we haven't talked about it. We work together, we eat together, we sleep in the same room, but we don't talk about what we're doing." Daniel's throat went dry. "What do you want to talk about?" "What happens when spring comes? When the pass opens, and I could leave if I wanted to. She paused. Do you want me to stay? The question was simple. The answer should have been simple too, but Daniel found himself struggling with words that wouldn't come. I don't know, he said finally, and it was maybe the most honest thing he'd ever said. Mara didn't look hurt, just thoughtful. You don't know if you want me to stay? I don't know how to want that anymore. Daniel stared at his hands. Every time I wanted it before, it didn't matter. They left anyway. So I stopped wanting things. Stopped planning past the next day. That's surviving, not living. Surviving is all I know how to do up here. Then maybe it's time to learn something else. Mara shifted closer, not quite touching him, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. I'm not the others, Daniel. I'm not Ellen or Rebecca or any of the rest. I came here knowing exactly what I was walking into. No illusions, no false promises. Why? Why come at all? Because in Denver, I was working 16 hours a day for enough money to eat and sleep in a room with 5 strangers. I was 26 years old with no prospects and no future. The broker offered me a chance at something different. She looked at him directly. I didn't come here expecting love or romance. I came expecting work and survival and maybe, if I was lucky, a partner, someone I could count on. You barely know me. I know you run off prospectors who insult me. I know you gave me your bed without being asked. I know you teach me things without making me feel stupid for not knowing them already. I know you haven't lied to me once, even when the truth made you look bad. She paused. That's enough to build on. Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted it so badly it scared him. What if you change your mind? He asked. What if spring comes and you realize you made a mistake? Then I'll tell you, I won't just disappear in the night. Mara's voice was firm. But Daniel, you need to decide something. Do you want a real partner, or do you want someone to help you survive until one of us dies? Because those are different things. What's the difference? A partner is someone you plan with, build with, someone you trust enough to be honest with even when it's hard. She stood, brushing snow from her skirt. Think about it. When you know the answer, tell me. She went inside, leaving Daniel on the porch step with the sun warming his face and his mind churning. He thought about the 7 women who'd left, about how he'd kept them at arm's length, never quite letting them in, always waiting for the inevitable goodbye. About how that waiting had maybe become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expected people to leave, you never gave them a reason to stay. But Mara hadn't asked for reasons. She'd asked for honesty, for a decision about what he actually wanted instead of what he was afraid of. Daniel sat there until his hands went numb with cold, and by the time he went inside, he thought he might have an answer. The next week tested them in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. A storm rolled in, not the violent, howling kind, but the slow, grinding type that lasted for days and buried everything under 3 feet of fresh powder. They were trapped inside again, but this time felt different because of the conversation on the porch. There was a tension now, not hostile but present, like they were both waiting for something to break or settle. Mara worked on a new project, using scraps of leather and fur to make something Daniel couldn't quite identify yet. He maintained his gear, sharpened his knives, tried to stay busy and not think too hard about the question she'd asked. On the 3rd day of the storm, the silence broke. I want a partner, Daniel said abruptly, setting down the knife he'd been honing. Mara looked up from her work. What? You asked what I wanted. I want a partner, someone to build with, not just survive with. The words came faster now, like a dam breaking. I don't know how to do that. I'll probably mess it up, but I want to try. Mara set down her sewing carefully. Okay. 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 She smiled, and it was real this time, reaching her eyes. But Daniel, being partners means actually talking to each other, not just when there's a crisis or a question that needs answering. Real talking. About what? Anything. Everything. She picked up her sewing again. Tell me something true. Something you've never told anyone else. Daniel thought about deflecting, but Mara was watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through every defense he'd built. I'm afraid I'm going to wake up and you'll be gone, he said quietly. Every morning. I open my eyes and think maybe this is the day you figured out what a mistake this was. That's not a truth, that's a fear. Feels true enough. Well, it's not. I'm not going anywhere. Mara knotted her thread, bit it off. My turn. Something true. I came up here thinking I'd be alone even with a husband. Thought we'd just exist in the same space, doing our jobs, nothing more. I didn't expect to actually like you. You like me? Don't let it go to your head. You're still terrible at conversation and you snore like a broken saw. Daniel felt his face heat. I don't snore. You absolutely do, like cutting lumber, but... She held up a hand when he started to protest. You're also kind and careful. And you don't treat me like I'm stupid or weak, so yeah, I like you. They looked at each other across the cabin, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not like in the stories where everything changed in a single moment. Just a small adjustment, like ice beginning to thaw. I like you too, Daniel said, and was surprised to find it was true. Good. Now tell me about the scars on your left hand. What? I've seen them. 3 scars across your knuckles. They're old but deep. What happened? Daniel looked at his hand, at the white lines across the knuckles. Broke it when I was 19. Got in a fight with a logging camp foreman who was cheating the workers. Hit him 3 times before my hand gave out. Did you win? He stopped cheating. That counts as a win. Mara studied him. You always had that temper? When things were unfair, yeah. Got me in trouble more than once. I can see that. She smiled. My turn. The scar on my right shoulder, you've probably seen it when I was changing. Knife fight in a Texas saloon when I was 17. Some drunk thought my friend was for sale. I thought different. You fight with knives? That once. Learned real quick that fighting with knives is a good way to get stabbed. She touched her shoulder absently. Got lucky. 2 inches to the left and I wouldn't be here. They traded stories until the fire burned low. Small truths and large ones. Embarrassing moments and proud ones. Daniel talked about his father, dead now, who taught him to track and trap but never to trust. Mara talked about her mother's garden in Texas, how she could make anything grow even in the worst drought. By the time they went to sleep, Daniel felt like he knew Mara better than he'd known any of the 7 women who'd come before. And more importantly, she knew him. The storm broke the next morning and Daniel went out to check the trap lines. The snow was deep, exhausting to walk through, but the exercise felt good after days inside. He found 1 rabbit, released a young fox like Mara had taught him, and was checking the last trap when he saw tracks. Fresh tracks. Human. Leading toward the cabin. Daniel's blood went cold. He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, and followed the tracks back. They were big. A man's boots. Heavy tread. The same tracks he'd seen when the prospectors came through. They led right to his cabin. Daniel ran, or tried to in the deep snow. Crashed through drifts, lungs burning, rifle clutched tight. If something had happened to Mara, if those men had come back while he was gone... He burst into the clearing and stopped short. Mara was standing on the porch with the rifle pointed at a man who stood in the snow with his hands raised. Not the prospectors, someone else. Older, maybe 50, with a thick beard and winter gear that looked expensive. Daniel, Mara said without taking her eyes off the stranger, this man says he knows you. Daniel Cross, the man called out. It's me, William Hartwell, from the trading post. Daniel moved closer, and sure enough, it was Hartwell. He looked different, bundled up in winter gear, but the voice was right. What are you doing here? Daniel asked. Looking for you. Lower the rifle, Mrs. Cross. I'm no threat. Mara kept it pointed at him. Daniel? It's all right. He's a friend, sort of. Sort of? Hartwell laughed. 6 years of fair dealing and I'm sort of a friend. Mara lowered the rifle slowly. Come inside then. But I'm keeping this handy. Inside, Hartwell stamped snow off his boots and accepted the coffee Mara poured. He studied her while he drank, and Daniel could see him reassessing whatever assumptions he'd made. You're different from the others, Hartwell said finally. So I've heard. Good different, the kind that might actually stick. He turned to Daniel. Which brings me to why I'm here. There's a situation developing at the trading post. What kind of situation? The legal kind. Territory surveyor came through last week. Says there's a dispute about property lines in this area. Your claim included. Daniel felt his stomach drop. What does that mean? Means someone's challenging your homestead, says you haven't met the requirements, continuous occupation, improvements to the land, that sort of thing. Hartwell set down his cup. They're saying because you couldn't keep a wife longer than a few weeks, you weren't really settling, just squatting. That's ridiculous, I know, but it's legal proceedings, territorial court. They want you to prove you've got a stable household, that you're actually building something permanent. He looked between Daniel and Mara. Can you prove that? Mara spoke before Daniel could. How? Witnesses, documentation, proof of marriage and cohabitation, improvements to the property. Hartwell pulled a paper from his coat. Court date is set for April. That's 8 weeks from now. You'll need to appear in person, both of you, and demonstrate that this isn't just another temporary arrangement. Daniel took the paper with numb fingers. 8 weeks. 8 weeks to prove that what he and Mara had built was real, was permanent, was worth protecting. Who's challenging the claim? He asked. Mining company out of Denver. They want the water rights to your creek. Been buying up land in this area for 2 years. Hartwell stood. I'm sorry, Daniel. I know this land means everything to you. After Hartwell left, Daniel and Mara sat at the table in silence. The court document lay between them, official and threatening. This is because of me, Daniel said finally. Because I couldn't make the others stay. No. This is because some company wants your water and they're using any excuse they can find. Mara picked up the document, read it carefully. But they're right about one thing. We need to prove this is permanent. How? We've been married less than 2 months. Then we make 2 months look like a lifetime. Mara stood, pacing. Improvements to the property, what counts? Building, planting, fencing, permanent structures. Then we build. We expand the cabin, add a proper kitchen area, build a better root cellar. Make it look like we're planning to stay for years, not months. In 8 weeks? In winter? We'll do what we can. And Daniel, she stopped pacing, looked at him directly. We need to actually be married, not just sharing space. The court will ask questions. They'll want to know if this is real. Daniel understood what she was saying. They'd been living like polite strangers who worked well together. But marriage meant more than that. It meant intimacy, trust, things Daniel had stopped believing he could have. I don't want to force you into anything, he said. You're not forcing me. I'm choosing. Mara sat down across from him. But we need to choose together. Really choose. Because if we show up in that court looking like two people who tolerate each other, we'll lose everything. What if we can't? We can. We just need to try. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. Partner, remember? We figure this out together. Daniel looked at her hand on his, small, calloused from work, warm despite the cold. Then he turned his hand over and held hers properly, fingers interlacing. Together, he said. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow gold and pink. Inside, Daniel Cross and Mara Velasquez sat holding hands across a rough wooden table. And for the first time in 8 years, Daniel thought maybe the mountain hadn't beaten him after all. They started building the next morning. Daniel had sketched rough plans in the dirt by firelight the night before, an extension to the cabin that would add a proper kitchen area and a second room. Nothing fancy, but enough to show permanence, enough to prove they were building a life, not just surviving one. We'll need more logs, he said, studying the framework in his mind. Good ones. Straight. How many? 30, maybe 40. Depends on how tall we go. Mara pulled on her coat. Then let's start cutting. The work was brutal. February didn't care about court dates or property disputes. The cold made everything harder. Axes bounced off frozen wood, saws stuck in sap that had turned to stone, and Daniel's hands cracked and bled even through his gloves. But Mara never complained. She learned to use a two-man saw, standing opposite Daniel and pulling in rhythm. Her hands blistered, then calloused over. When a log slipped and nearly crushed her foot, she just stepped back and said, "Let's try that again." They felled trees in the mornings, stripped bark in the afternoons, and dragged logs back to the cabin using rope and sheer stubbornness. At night, they fell into bed too exhausted to talk, muscles screaming, backs aching. On the fourth day, Daniel's axe slipped on a knot and the blade bit into his left thigh instead of the wood. Hell! He dropped the axe, pressing his hand against the cut. Blood welled between his fingers, hot against the cold air. Mara was there in seconds. How bad? Bad enough? She helped him to a stump, pulled his hand away to look. The cut was deep but clean, maybe 4 inches long. Not life-threatening if they kept it from festering, but enough to stop work for days they didn't have. We need to get you inside, Mara said. We need to finish inside, now. Her voice had that tone that meant arguing was pointless. Daniel let her help him back to the cabin, limping, leaving a trail of red drops in the snow. Inside, Mara heated water and cleaned the wound with a gentleness that surprised him. Her hands were steady as she threaded a needle. This is going to hurt, she said. I know. She stitched him up with the same precision she brought to everything else. Daniel gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound, even when the needle pulled through skin that screamed in protest. You're good at this, he managed. Had practice. My brother was always getting hurt, falling out of trees, getting kicked by horses, stepping on nails. She tied off the last stitch. He said I should have been a doctor. Why didn't you? Women can't be doctors in Texas. Not really. She cleaned the needle, put it away. Besides, we didn't have money for that kind of education. We barely had money for food. Daniel watched her work, efficient and calm despite the blood. You ever wish things were different, that you had different choices? Every day. But wishing doesn't change anything. She looked at him. You need to stay off this leg for at least 3 days. Let it start healing. We don't have 3 days. Then we lose the leg to infection and you definitely can't work. Mara stood, wiping her hands. I can keep cutting. I'm not as strong as you, but I can do enough. Mara, don't. She held up a hand. We're partners, right? That means when one of us goes down, the other picks up the weight. So shut up and rest your leg. She went back outside before he could argue. Through the window, Daniel watched her pick up his axe, too heavy for her really, and swing at a tree with determination that outweighed technique. He spent the next 3 days going slowly insane. Sitting still wasn't in his nature, and watching Mara work herself to exhaustion while he did nothing made him want to punch through the wall. But she was right about the leg. It needed time to heal, and pushing it would only make things worse. So he did what he could from inside. He sharpened tools, prepared meals, sorted through what supplies they had left, and calculated what they'd need to make it to April. The numbers weren't good. Without his trapping income, they were burning through reserves faster than anticipated. We're going to run out of coffee, he said when Mara came in on the second evening, snow-covered and exhausted. I know. And flour, maybe by mid-March. We'll make it work. She hung up her coat, wincing as she moved. How's the leg? Better. How's your back? Fine. Liar. Mara smiled despite herself. Okay, it hurts like hell, but it'll be fine tomorrow. Daniel stood carefully, testing his weight on the injured leg. It held, though it ached deep in the muscle. Let me look. It's just sore. Mara, let me look. She turned around and he lifted the back of her shirt. Her muscles were knotted like rope, hard and inflamed from days of work her body wasn't conditioned for. Sit, he said. Daniel, you fixed me up. Let me return the favor. She sat, and Daniel worked his thumbs into the knots with the same care she'd shown stitching his leg. She gasped once, then went quiet, breathing through the pain as he loosened muscles that had seized up. Where'd you learn this? She asked after a while. Logging camps, men got hurt, you learned to help, or you watched them cripple themselves. He found another knot, worked it carefully. Your right shoulder's worse than your left. That's the old knife wound. It gets tight when I overwork it. Then stop overworking it. Says the man who cut his own leg open because he wouldn't slow down. Fair point. Daniel kept working until he felt her muscles start to relax, her breathing deepen. When he finished, Mara rolled her shoulders experimentally. Better? He asked. Much. Thank you. That night they sat closer than usual by the fire. Not touching, but close enough that Daniel could feel her warmth, smell the wood smoke in her hair. Tell me something, Mara said quietly. About what? Anything. Something I don't know yet. Daniel thought, I had a brother, older. He died when I was 12. How? Mining accident, cave-in. They found his body 3 days later. The memory was old, worn smooth by years, but it still hurt. My father was never the same after, just gave up, died 2 years later. Doctors said it was his heart, but I think he just didn't want to live anymore. Mara's hand found his in the darkness. I'm sorry. Long time ago. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, it didn't. Your turn, Daniel said. Mara was quiet for a long moment. My mother used to sing. Mexican songs her mother taught her. I don't remember all the words anymore, but I remember how her voice sounded. Like home. Sing something. I can't sing like she could. I don't care. Mara hesitated, then started singing softly in Spanish. Daniel didn't understand the words, but the melody was sweet and sad, full of longing for something lost. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked in places, went flat in others, but it was real and human and beautiful in its imperfection. When she finished, they sat in silence, still holding hands. Thank you, Daniel said. For what? For being here, for not leaving. I told you I wouldn't. I know, but hearing it and believing it are different things. Mara squeezed his hand. Then I'll keep saying it until you believe it. By the end of the week, Daniel was back on his feet, and they returned to building with renewed urgency. The extension took shape slowly, walls rising, roof beams fitted into place. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid, permanent. They worked through storms and clear days alike, racing against the calendar. March arrived with more snow and winds that tried to tear their progress apart. Twice they had to rebuild sections that collapsed in the night. Once, a support beam Daniel was lifting slipped and nearly crushed Mara's hand. Careful, he shouted, catching it. I am being careful. Then be more careful. Then stop dropping things on me. They glared at each other, both breathing hard, both frustrated and exhausted. Then Mara started laughing, that same unexpected laugh that caught Daniel off guard every time. What's funny? He demanded. Us, fighting about being careful while we're doing something completely insane. She wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cold. We're going to kill ourselves trying to prove we want to live here. Daniel found himself smiling. Yeah, probably. Well, if we die, at least we die building something. That's a terrible philosophy. You got a better one? He didn't. Mid-March brought a break in the weather. 3 days of clear skies and temperatures that almost felt warm. They used the time to finish the exterior and start on the interior. Daniel built shelves while Mara fashioned a proper counter from salvaged wood. They worked in companionable silence now, each knowing what needed doing without discussion. We need to talk about the court, Mara said on the second clear day. Daniel had been avoiding thinking about it. What about it? What they're going to ask. What we need to say. She set down her hammer. They'll want to know if this marriage is real. It is real. Is it? Mara looked at him directly. We're partners. We work together. But Daniel, we haven't. She didn't finish, but Daniel understood. They shared a cabin, shared work, shared their lives in every practical way. But they still slept separately, still maintained that invisible line between partnership and marriage. What do you want? He asked. I want to know what you want, because I can't be the only one deciding this. Daniel sat down on the half-finished counter. I want you to stay, not just until April, not just to win the court case. I want you to stay because you want to be here, with me. I do want that. Then what's the problem? The problem is I need to know you want it too, really want it, not just because you need someone to help prove your claim, but because you want a life with me. Mara's voice was steady, but her eyes were vulnerable. I've spent too much of my life being wanted for what I could do, not who I was. I won't do that again. The honesty cut through every defense Daniel had left. He'd been protecting himself, holding back, afraid that if he admitted how much he'd come to need her, she'd use it against him, or leave, and take it with her. But Mara wasn't the others. She'd proven that 100 times over. I want a life with you, he said quietly. I want to wake up and see you there. I want to build things together and argue about stupid things and teach each other what we know. He stopped, struggling. I want to stop being afraid that tomorrow you'll be gone. Then stop being afraid. Mara crossed the space between them, stood close enough that Daniel could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. I'm not going anywhere. I chose this. I chose you. And I'll keep choosing you until you believe it. Daniel reached up, touched her face carefully, like she might break. What if I mess this up? Then we fix it. That's what partners do. He kissed her then, clumsy and uncertain, half expecting her to pull away. But Mara kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and something that had been locked tight in Daniel's chest finally loosened. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Mara smiled. Took you long enough? I'm slow. I noticed. She kissed him again, softer this time. Come to bed tonight. The real bed. Not the floor. You sure? I'm sure. That night Daniel lay beside Mara in the bed they'd share from now on, listening to her breathe in the darkness. Her hand found his under the blankets, fingers interlacing. Daniel? She whispered. Yeah? I'm glad I came here. Me too. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. But inside in the cabin they were building together, Daniel Cross felt warm for the first time in years. The next morning, they woke tangled together, and Daniel spent a moment just watching her sleep. Her hair had come loose from its braid, spreading across the pillow. Her face was relaxed, peaceful, beautiful. She opened one eye. You're staring. Sorry. Don't be. She stretched, then winced. Ow, everything hurts. Mine too. They got up slowly, bodies protesting weeks of brutal work, but they moved around each other easily now, the awkwardness gone. Mara made coffee while Daniel stoked the fire. They ate standing up, too sore to sit. How much more, Mara asked, looking at the extension. Week and a half, maybe, if the weather holds and nothing else breaks. And if something breaks? We fix it and keep going. Daniel drained his coffee. We don't have a choice. They didn't. The court date loomed like a storm on the horizon, just 3 weeks away now. 3 weeks to finish the building, to gather their evidence, to prepare their case. 3 weeks to prove their marriage was worth protecting. They worked like the mountain itself was chasing them. The extension's interior came together piece by piece, a proper kitchen with storage, a separate room that could be used for whatever they needed. Mara insisted on a window in the new room, and Daniel cut one, even though it cost them half a day. Why is it so important? He asked. Because I spent 3 months living in a room with no windows. Never again. She helped him fit the frame. Light matters. She was right. The window transformed the space, made it feel like part of the world instead of hiding from it. 2 weeks before the court date, they finished the main construction. The extension wasn't perfect. The walls weren't quite straight. The roof had a slight sag on one side, but it was done. It was permanent. It said they were staying. Now what? Mara asked, surveying their work. Now we document everything. Measurements, materials, dates. Hartwell said we'd need proof of improvements. They spent the next 2 days measuring and recording. Daniel's handwriting was rough, but Mara's was neat and clear. She made lists and drawings, noting every change they'd made to the property. This should be enough, she said, reviewing their documentation. Should be, but nothing's guaranteed. When is it ever? A week before the court date, they made the trip to the trading post. The trail was clearer now. March had brought the first hints of thaw, turning the upper snow to slush during the day, freezing it hard at night. Hartwell looked them over when they arrived. You both look like hell. Thanks, Daniel said dryly. No, I mean it. You look like you've been working yourselves to death. But Hartwell was smiling. Which is exactly what you needed to do. You finished the addition? Yeah. Good. I'll come up and photograph it tomorrow. Bring a witness too. Territorial surveyor owes me a favor. His testimony will help. They stocked up on supplies, spending money they didn't really have on things they'd need for the journey to court and for whatever came after. Mara bought fabric. Good fabric, the kind you bought when you planned to stay somewhere long enough to need clothes that lasted. Expensive, Daniel said, watching her count out the coins. Worth it. Mara folded the fabric carefully. I'm making curtains for the new window. And maybe a new dress. Something nice for court. The idea of Mara in a new dress, standing beside him in court, defending their life together, it made something swell in Daniel's chest. Pride, maybe. Or hope. Back at the cabin, they spent the evenings preparing what they'd say. Mara made Daniel practice answering questions, playing the part of a hostile lawyer. Why should we believe this marriage is legitimate? She asked in an exaggerated formal voice. Because it is. Wrong. Too defensive. Mara sat back. Try again. Calmer. Because my wife and I have built a life here together. You can see the evidence in the improvements we've made to the property. Better. But call me by name. My wife Mara makes it more real. They practiced until Daniel could answer without his voice shaking, until the words felt natural instead of rehearsed. Mara was better at it than he was. She had a way of talking that sounded honest and confident at the same time. You should do most of the talking, Daniel said. No, they need to hear from both of us. Mara squeezed his hand. We're in this together, remember? 3 days before they were supposed to leave for court, a massive storm rolled in. Not snow this time, but freezing rain that coated everything in ice and made travel impossible. We can't leave in this, Mara said, watching ice accumulate on the windows. We have to. Court's in 3 days. And we'll die trying to get there. Daniel, even the horses can't walk on ice like this. She was right, but that didn't make it easier. They'd worked so hard, built so much, prepared so thoroughly, and now the weather might destroy everything anyway. The storm lasted 2 days. 2 days of ice building up, of trees cracking and falling under the weight, of the whole world turning into a frozen death trap. On the second day, part of their new roof collapsed under the ice load. Daniel stared at the damage, something breaking inside him. We're not going to make it. Yes, we are. Mara was already clearing debris. We fix this, we wait for the thaw, and we go. The court date is 3 days from now. This ice won't last that long. March ice never does. She looked at him. Don't give up now. Not after everything. They fixed the roof in freezing rain, fingers numb, ice forming in their hair and beards. By the time they finished, Daniel couldn't feel his feet and Mara's lips were blue. But the roof held. The next morning, the temperature rose. Not much, but enough. The ice began to melt, dripping from trees and roofs, turning the ground to mud. By afternoon, the trail was passable. Barely. We leave at first light, Daniel said. Agreed. They packed that night, their documentation, clean clothes, what money they had left. Mara wore the dress she'd made, simple but well-fitted, with a shawl she'd sewn from the fabric she'd bought. She looked beautiful and capable, and like someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. You ready? Daniel asked. No, but we're going anyway. They left before dawn, the trail still treacherous with mud and ice. Every step was a gamble, every mile an achievement. But they kept moving, driven by deadline and determination. 20 miles to the territorial courthouse, 20 miles to prove their life was worth protecting. They made camp that night in a grove of pines, too exhausted to talk. Daniel built a fire while Mara unpacked their bedrolls. They ate cold jerky and hard bread, saving their energy for tomorrow's final push. What if we lose? Mara asked quietly. Then we appeal, fight it another way. And if we can't? Daniel didn't want to think about it. Losing the land meant losing everything. The cabin, the work, the life they'd built. It meant starting over somewhere else, somewhere that wouldn't feel like home. Then we figure it out, he said finally. Together. Mara nodded and they crawled into their bedrolls. But sleep came hard, and Daniel lay awake staring at stars through pine branches, wondering if tomorrow would bring victory or ruin. They reached the courthouse by mid-afternoon the next day, tired and muddy but present. The building was intimidating, 2 stories of brick and authority, with territorial flags snapping in the wind. Inside, a clerk directed them to a waiting room. Other people sat on benches, all with their own land disputes and legal troubles. Daniel and Mara sat together, hands clasped, waiting for their names to be called. Cross versus Mountain Peak Mining Company, a bailiff announced finally. They stood and walked into the courtroom together. The judge was a severe-looking woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. The mining company's lawyer was a slick man from Denver with expensive clothes and a smile that made Daniel want to punch him. "State your case," the judge said to the lawyer. "Your Honor, Mountain Peak Mining Company challenges the homestead claim of Daniel Cross on the grounds that he has failed to meet the requirements for permanent settlement. Evidence shows that Mr. Cross has been unable to maintain a stable household, with 7 previous marriage attempts, all ending in abandonment within weeks." 8 marriages, Mara said clearly. The lawyer paused. "Excuse me?" 8 marriages. I'm the 8th. Mara stood straighter. "And I'm still here." "For how long? 6 weeks? 2 months?" The lawyer's smile turned condescending. "Mrs. Cross, if that's even your real name, Mara Velasquez Cross, and we've been married 10 weeks. She produced their documentation. "In that time, we've built a permanent addition to the cabin, improved the water collection system, expanded food storage, and created infrastructure intended to last for years. We have photographs and witness testimony to support this." The judge took the documentation, studied it. "Impressive. But the question remains, is this a legitimate marriage or a convenient arrangement to protect a land claim?" "It's legitimate," Daniel said. His voice was rough but steady. "I know my history makes it hard to believe. 7 women couldn't handle the isolation and the work. I don't blame them for leaving, but Mara is different. She's my partner, my wife. And we're building a life together because we want to, not because we have to." "Can you prove that?" the judge asked. "Look at the photographs," Mara said. "Look at what we built in the dead of winter. Nobody does that for a legal fiction. Nobody risks their life and breaks their back and goes without sleep for something that isn't real." The judge studied them for a long moment. Then she looked at the photographs, at the documentation, at the witness statements Hartwell had provided. "Mr. Cross," she said finally, "you've had a complicated history with marriage." "Yes, ma'am. And yet you expect this court to believe that after 7 failures, the 8th attempt is genuine?" Daniel looked at Mara, at the woman who'd stayed when everyone else had run, who'd saved his life on a mountain trail and argued with him about releasing baby foxes and sung Spanish songs by firelight. "I don't expect you to believe anything," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth. This marriage is real. This life is real. And I'll fight for it until I can't fight anymore." The judge sat back in her chair. "Mrs. Cross, why did you come to Colorado? What were you running from?" "Poverty," Mara said simply. "I was working myself to death in Denver for enough money to barely survive. The marriage broker offered me a different option. Not an easier one, but different. And when you arrived and saw the conditions, the isolation, the man with 7 failed marriages, I saw work that needed doing and a partner willing to do it with me. That was enough." "No dreams of romance? No expectations of an easier life?" "No, I expected exactly what I got. Hard work, cold weather, and a man who's better with actions than words." Mara's voice was firm. "And I chose to stay because that's enough for me, because we're building something that matters." The mining company's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is clearly a performance designed to—" "Sit down," the judge said. "I've heard enough from you." She studied the documents for another long moment. The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, the judge looked up. "The homestead claim is upheld. Mountain Peak Mining Company's challenge is denied." Daniel felt his knees go weak. Beside him, Mara grabbed his hand so hard he thought his fingers might break. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm imposing a fine on the mining company for frivolous litigation clearly designed to intimidate a legitimate homesteader. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down like thunder. They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunshine, and Daniel realized he was shaking. Not from fear now, but from relief so profound it felt like pain. "We won," Mara said, and she was shaking too. "Yeah, we actually won." They stood there on the courthouse steps, 2 people covered in trail dust and exhaustion, holding on to each other like they might fall without the support. "What now?" Mara asked. Daniel looked at her, at his wife, his partner, the woman who'd chosen him when no one else would. Now we go home. They rode back slowly, taking their time now that the urgency was gone. The trail was easier without the weight of possible ruin hanging over them. They camped again in the pine grove, and this time Daniel slept soundly, Mara warm beside him. When they finally saw the cabin through the trees, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just relief, not just satisfaction, but something deeper, more permanent. He felt like he'd finally come home. The cabin looked different when they returned. Not physically, it was still the same rough structure with its new extension and crooked roof. But to Daniel, it felt transformed. This wasn't just a place he survived anymore. It was home. Their home. Mara dropped her pack by the door and walked through both rooms slowly, touching the walls they'd built, running her fingers along the window frame she'd insisted on. When she turned back to Daniel, her eyes were bright. "It's really ours now," she said. "Yeah. No one can take it." "No." She crossed to him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and pressed her face against his chest. Daniel held her, feeling the tension drain from both of them. They'd been holding their breath for so long, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now, finally, they could breathe. That night, they celebrated with the last of their coffee and a rabbit stew that tasted better than it had any right to. They sat at their table in their cabin on their land, and for the first time since Mara had arrived, Daniel allowed himself to think about the future beyond the next day or week. "We should plant a garden," he said suddenly. Mara looked up from her stew. "What?" "In spring, when the ground thaws. We should plant vegetables, maybe some herbs." The words came faster now, ideas forming as he spoke. "That flat area south of the cabin, it gets good sun. We could fence it, keep the deer out." "I don't know anything about mountain gardening." "Neither do I, but we can learn." Daniel felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Excitement, maybe. Hope for something beyond mere survival. "And chickens? We should get chickens." Mara started to smile. "Chickens? Why not? Fresh eggs, meat when we need it. They're hardy enough for winters if we build them a proper coop." "You've thought about this." "Not until right now, but yeah." He reached across the table, took her hand. "I want to build more than just walls, Mara. I want to build something that lasts, something that grows." She squeezed his fingers. "Then we'll build it." April brought the thaw in earnest. Snow melted from the lower elevations, swelling the creek until it roared like something alive. The mountains shed their winter white slowly, revealing rock and new grass and wildflowers that turned the meadows into riots of color. Daniel and Mara worked from dawn to dusk, but it was different now. Not the desperate urgency of before, but the steady rhythm of people building a future. They repaired winter damage, restocked their supplies, and started planting the garden. "Potatoes first," Mara said, sketching in the dirt with a stick. "They're reliable. Then maybe beans, squash, carrots if the season's long enough." "How do you know what grows up here?" "I don't. But I'm guessing based on what we saw at the trading post." She looked up at him. "We'll make mistakes. Some things won't survive. But we learn and try again next year." Next year. The casual way she said it, like next year was a given, not a hope, made Daniel's throat tight. They broke ground on the garden in late April, once the soil had thawed enough to work. It was hard digging, rocky and stubborn, but they cleared a plot 20 feet square and amended it with what composted matter they could find. "Not much," Daniel said, surveying their work. "It's enough to start." Mara wiped sweat from her forehead. "We build from here." She was right. The garden was small, but it was theirs. They planted seeds Hartwell had ordered special from Denver. Expensive, but worth it. Potato eyes went in first, then bean seeds, then carrots in careful rows. "Think they'll grow?" Mara asked, patting soil over the last carrot seed. "I think we'll find out." They built the fence next, rough posts and salvaged wire, just enough to keep deer from destroying their work. It wasn't pretty, but it served its purpose. The chickens came in May. Hartwell had located 6 hens and a rooster from a failing farm near the trading post. Daniel built a coop against the south side of the cabin where it would catch winter sun, with the nesting boxes made from scrap wood and a door that latched tight against predators. The birds were nervous at first, huddling together and eyeing their new surroundings with suspicion. But Mara talked to them while she scattered feed, nonsense words in Spanish and English, and within a week they were following her around like she was their mother. "They like you better than me," Daniel said, watching the hens cluster around Mara's feet. "That's because you don't talk to them. They're chickens." "So?" "Everything likes being talked to." She scattered more feed. "Even you." Daniel couldn't argue with that. The garden sprouted in early June, first the potatoes, then the beans, then finally the carrots. Mara checked them every morning, pulling weeds and watching for pests. When the first potato plant flowered, she came running to get Daniel. "Look, flowers!" He looked at the small purple blooms and felt ridiculously proud. "We did that." "We did." They stood there grinning at a potato plant like idiots, and Daniel realized he'd never been happier. But the mountain wasn't done testing them. In mid-June, a late frost came through and killed half their bean plants. Mara stood in the garden, staring at the blackened leaves, and Daniel saw her fighting tears. "We can replant," he said. "It's too late in the season. They won't mature before fall frost." "Then we plant something else, something faster." "Like what?" "I don't know, but we'll figure it out." They salvaged what they could, replanted with lettuce and radishes that Hartwell scrounged from somewhere. The new crops grew, but the loss stung. A reminder that the mountain gave and took on its own terms, not theirs. July brought different challenges. The chickens attracted predators. First a fox that Daniel shot after it killed 2 hens, then a hawk that took a third. They reinforced the coop, added more wire, stayed vigilant. But 3 hens were gone, and the rooster had a scar across his back from the fox attack. "Maybe this was a bad idea," Mara said, burying the last hen. "It's not a bad idea. It's just hard. Everything up here is hard." "Yeah." Daniel finished covering the grave with rocks. "But we're still here, and so are the other chickens. We adapt." Mara looked at him. "You've changed." "What do you mean?" "When I first got here, you would have said something like, 'The mountain always wins,' or 'Nothing good lasts.' Now you're talking about adapting and trying again." She smiled slightly. "It's different." Daniel thought about that. She was right. He had changed. Or maybe Mara had changed him. Shown him that survival wasn't the same as living, that building something meant accepting you'd lose pieces along the way. "You changed me," he said. "No. I just reminded you that you're not dead yet." The harvest came in late August. The potatoes yielded better than expected, enough to fill half their root cellar and trade some at the trading post. The carrots were small but sweet. The lettuce and radishes had done well, providing fresh greens they hadn't tasted in months. They dug potatoes together, their hands in the dirt, sorting the good from the damaged. It was simple work, but satisfying in a way Daniel had never experienced. This was food they'd grown, proof that they could do more than just take from the land. "Next year we plant more," Mara said, wiping dirt from a particularly large potato. "Twice as much. And fruit. We should find some berry bushes, transplant them near the cabin. That'll take years before they produce." "So? We've got years." She looked at him, her meaning clear. They weren't just planning for next season anymore. They were planning for decades. That evening, sitting on their porch with full bellies and tired muscles, Daniel brought up something he'd been thinking about for weeks. "The broker sent another letter," he said. Mara stiffened. "When?" "Last month. Hartwell gave it to me when I went for supplies." "What did it say?" "Asked if we needed another bride. Said he had women interested in the area." Daniel pulled the letter from his pocket, handed it to her. Mara read it, her face carefully neutral. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to talk to you first." "About what? You want another wife?" Her voice was sharp, edged with something that might have been fear. "No, that's not—" Daniel took the letter back, crumpled it. "I want to tell him to stop sending letters, to take me off his list, because I'm not looking anymore." The tension left Mara's shoulders. "Oh. I should have told him months ago, but I wanted to make sure. I wanted to ask you first." "Ask me what?" "If you want me to close that door, permanently." Mara was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Then she said, "I'm pregnant." The world stopped. Daniel stared at her, unable to process the words. What? I'm pregnant, about 3 months, I think. Mara still wouldn't look at him. I wasn't sure at first, but now I am. How long have you known? For certain, 2 weeks. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was scared. Finally, she turned to face him, and Daniel saw fear in her eyes. Real fear, the kind he'd never seen there before. What if you didn't want it? What if you decided this was too much, too permanent? Mara, 7 women left you, Daniel, and now I'm telling you I'm bringing a child into this. Into a cabin on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. What if... He kissed her, hard and desperate, cutting off the spiral of fear. When they broke apart, both were shaking. I want this, he said fiercely. I want you, and I want our child, and I want this life we're building. All of it. You're sure? I'm sure. He took her hands. Are you scared? Terrified. Me too. Mara laughed, the sound wet with unshed tears. We're going to be terrible at this. Probably, but we'll figure it out, like everything else. They sat there as the stars came out, holding each other, trying to wrap their minds around the impossible future that had just become real. The next morning, Daniel burned the broker's letter in the stove and watched the ashes float up the chimney. Then he wrote his own letter, short, blunt, final. No more brides. I found what I was looking for, Daniel Cross. He gave it to Hartwell on his next supply run, along with news of the pregnancy. Hartwell shook his hand hard enough to hurt. About damn time, he said. Congratulations. Word spread through the scattered mountain community, the trappers and traders, the few other homesteaders clinging to impossible land. Some came by to offer congratulations or advice. Others brought gifts, a cradle one man had carved years ago for a grandchild who'd never been born, baby clothes from a woman whose own children were grown. People are good sometimes, Mara said, folding the tiny clothes. Yeah, sometimes they are. They spent the fall preparing. Daniel reinforced the cabin, sealed every gap against winter drafts. Mara sewed baby clothes from scraps and new fabric, working by firelight. They argued about names. Daniel wanted something traditional. Mara wanted something meaningful. What about Elena, she suggested. For a girl. What does it mean? Light. Daniel thought about that. About bringing a child into a dark cabin on a dark mountain and choosing to name her for Light. I like it. And for a boy? I don't know. What do you think? Samuel. It means told by the universe. She smiled. Seems fitting for a child born up here. Samuel or Elena? Okay. The first snow came in October, earlier than usual. They were ready. Root cellar full, firewood stacked, chickens in their reinforced coop. Mara was showing now, her belly rounding under her dresses. She moved more carefully, and Daniel found himself watching her constantly, worrying about things he'd never worried about before. I'm pregnant, not dying, she said when she caught him staring. I know. Then stop looking at me like I'm going to break. Can't help it. She softened, crossing to where he sat. I know you're scared. I am too. But Daniel, women have been having babies forever, even up here. We'll manage. What if something goes wrong? Then we deal with it, like everything else. She took his hand, placed it on her belly. Feel that? Daniel felt a flutter under his palm, faint, but there. His child, moving, real. That's our baby, Mara said. Fighting already. Must get it from you. He laughed despite his fear. From me? Stubborn, won't quit even when things are hard. She kissed him gently. Yeah, from you. Winter settled in hard and deep. By November, they were snowed in for days at a time. But the cabin was warm, their supplies adequate, and they'd learned to live with each other in the small space without going crazy. Mara's belly grew larger. She tired more easily now, napping in the afternoons while Daniel worked on carving a cradle from pine wood. He wasn't as good as the man who'd given them the first one, but he worked carefully, thinking about his child sleeping in it. On the long winter nights, they talked about the future. Will it be too isolated, Mara asked one evening, for a child? I don't know. I grew up with neighbors, other kids. This will be different. Maybe we should think about moving closer to the trading post, so the baby has people. Daniel had thought about this too. You want to leave? No, but I want what's best for the child. What if what's best is having parents who love each other and work hard and teach them to do the same? He set down his carving. We can make trips to the trading post more often, let them meet other kids, but this, he gestured around the cabin. This is home. This is what we built. I don't want to give it up unless we have to. Mara was quiet, thinking. Okay, we stay, but we make sure the baby knows there's a world beyond this mountain. Deal. December brought the hardest cold Daniel had experienced in 8 years. Temperatures dropped to 30 below. The chickens huddled in their coop, barely laying. The creek froze solid. Daniel had to break ice twice a day just to get water, but inside they stayed warm. Mara was 7 months along now, moving slowly, her back aching. Daniel took over more of the work, insisting she rest. I'm not an invalid, she protested. No, but you're carrying our child. Let me help. You do help, too much. I need to keep moving or I'll go crazy. So they compromised. Mara did light work, mending, cooking, feeding the chickens. Daniel did everything else. It worked mostly, though sometimes they still argued about who should carry the water or who should check the traps. On Christmas, they exchanged gifts. Daniel had carved Mara a set of wooden spoons, each one different. Mara had sewn Daniel a new shirt, better fitted than his old ones, with careful stitches that must have taken weeks. It's beautiful, he said, trying it on. You needed it. All your shirts are held together with patches. I like your patches. Well, now you have options. She smiled. Thank you for the spoons. They're perfect. They spent Christmas Day quietly. No church, no big meal, just the two of them and the baby not yet born. But it felt complete anyway, like they didn't need anything else. January passed in a blur of cold and waiting. Mara grew more uncomfortable, unable to find a position that didn't hurt. Daniel worried constantly, trying to hide it and failing. What if I can't help? He asked one night. What if something happens and I don't know what to do? Then you do your best. That's all anyone can do. Mara shifted, trying to ease her back. Women have been having babies for thousands of years, Daniel. Usually it works out. Usually isn't always. No, but I'm strong and stubborn, and I have you. She took his hand. That's enough. February arrived with lighter snow and the first hints that winter might eventually end. Mara was 9 months now, ready to burst, impatient and uncomfortable and beautiful in a way that made Daniel's chest hurt. On February 14th, almost exactly a year since she'd arrived, Mara's water broke. Daniel had been outside checking on the chickens. He came back in to find her standing by the table, fluid pooling at her feet, her face pale. It's time, she said. Now? Yes, now. She gripped the table edge. Help me to the bed. Daniel's mind went blank with panic. Then training kicked in. Not training for childbirth, because he had none, but training for emergencies. Stay calm, assess, act. He helped Mara to the bed, got her comfortable, started heating water like he'd seen in somewhere. Books, maybe. He had no idea what he was doing. Daniel? Mara's voice was strained. Stop panicking. I'm not panicking. You're panicking. I can see it. She grimaced through a contraction. There's a book in my things about childbirth. Read it. He found the book, worn, clearly read multiple times, and flipped through it desperately. Instructions, diagrams, warnings about things that could go wrong. His panic increased. Just the basics, Mara said. I know most of it. You're just backup. She walked him through what he needed to do, where to put his hands, when to help, and when to let her body work. How to tell if something was wrong. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of Mara working through contractions, breathing like the book said, gripping Daniel's hand hard enough to break bones. 14 hours of Daniel feeling completely useless and terrified. When things got bad, when Mara started bleeding more than the book said was normal, Daniel prepared to ride for help. But Mara grabbed his arm. Don't leave me. But it'll be over before you get back. For good or bad. Stay. So he stayed, and worked with her, and prayed to mountains and fate, and anything that might be listening that his wife and child would survive. At dawn on February 15th, as the first light touched the snow outside their window, their daughter was born. She came out screaming, angry at the cold and the light and the world in general. Daniel caught her awkwardly, terrified he'd drop her, and placed her on Mara's chest while he cut the cord with shaking hands. "Elena," Mara whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "Our Elena." The baby had dark hair like her mother, and pale skin like her father, and lungs that could wake the dead. She was tiny and perfect and completely overwhelming. Daniel cleaned them both with warm water, helped Mara deliver the afterbirth, checked for the complications the book warned about. Everything seemed okay. Not perfect. Mara was exhausted and sore. The baby was small, but alive. Both alive. He wrapped Elena in the softest blanket they had and placed her back in Mara's arms. They stared at their daughter, this impossible thing they'd created, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not just love. He'd expected that. But purpose. Clarity. This was what he'd been building toward. Not just the cabin or the garden or winning the court case. This family, this future. "You did it," he said to Mara. "We did it." Elena squalled again, and Mara guided her to her breast. The baby latched on clumsily, but she latched, and peace descended on the cabin. Outside, the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the snow gold and pink. Inside, Daniel Cross sat beside his wife and daughter and felt for the first time in his life like he'd truly found home. The first week with Elena was chaos. Daniel had survived blizzards and near starvation and 7 failed marriages, but nothing prepared him for a newborn who screamed at 2-hour intervals and refused to sleep for more than 40 minutes at a time. Mara was exhausted, her body still healing, trying to figure out feeding while dealing with pain Daniel couldn't help with. "I don't know what she wants," Mara said on the third night, tears streaming down her face as Elena wailed. "I fed her, changed her. She won't stop crying." Daniel took the baby, held her against his chest, and walked. Just walked, back and forth across their small cabin, humming tunelessly because he didn't know any lullabies. Eventually, Elena quieted, her tiny fist curled against his shirt, her breathing evening out. "How did you do that?" Mara asked. "I have no idea." But it worked, so Daniel walked, miles probably pacing their cabin while Mara slept in desperate snatches. His legs ached and his arms cramped, and he'd never been more tired in his life. But when Elena looked up at him with those dark eyes that were still figuring out how to focus, something in him settled. This was his daughter, his family, worth every sleepless night. By the second week, they'd found something resembling a rhythm. Not smooth, nothing about new parenthood was smooth, but functional. Mara figured out feeding, Daniel figured out soothing, and Elena figured out that crying got her what she needed. "She's going to be stubborn," Mara said, watching Elena refuse to sleep despite obvious exhaustion. "Gets it from you." "From me? You're the most stubborn person I've ever met." "That's different. I'm persistent." "That's just stubborn, with better publicity." But Mara was smiling, and Elena finally gave up her fight and fell asleep. March brought the first real thaw. Snow melted in earnest, revealing a winter's worth of damage. Broken branches, torn sections of fence, places where the cabin roof had leaked. Daniel assessed it all while carrying Elena in a sling Mara had fashioned from an old blanket. "Going to be a lot of work," he told his daughter, who gurgled at him incomprehensibly. "But we'll manage. Your mother and I are good at managing." Elena grabbed his beard and pulled. Daniel winced, but didn't pull away. The book said babies needed to explore their world, and apparently his beard qualified. Mara was recovering well, though she tired easily and her body had changed in ways that sometimes frustrated her. She couldn't lift what she used to, couldn't work as long, but she adapted, finding ways to contribute that didn't strain her healing body. "I'm not useless," she insisted when Daniel tried to take over all the heavy work. "Never said you were." "You're thinking it." "I'm thinking you just had a baby and need time to heal. That's not the same as useless." She studied him. "When did you get wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just paying attention." April arrived with mud and new grass and the garden needing attention. Daniel tilled the soil while Mara watched from the porch, Elena asleep against her chest. They'd plant bigger this year, twice the space, more variety. They knew what worked now, what the mountain would tolerate. "We should get another rooster," Mara said, "in case something happens to this one. And more hens. Replace the ones we lost. We're building an empire here." Daniel laughed. "A chicken empire in the middle of nowhere, living the dream." "It's not nowhere. It's home." She was right. Somewhere along the way, this isolated patch of mountain had transformed from a place Daniel survived into a place he belonged. Not because the land had changed, but because he had. Because Mara had shown him the difference. They planted in late April, working together like they had the year before, but different now. Elena lay on a blanket nearby, watching clouds, making the sounds babies made. Sometimes she cried and they'd stop to tend to her. Sometimes she just observed, content to be part of the work, even if she didn't understand it. "She's going to grow up thinking this is normal," Daniel said, patting soil over potato eyes. "What? Gardening? All of it. The isolation, the work, the mountain. She won't know anything else." "Is that bad?" Daniel thought about his own childhood. A mining town, other kids, the constant noise of industry and people. He'd left it all behind and never looked back. "No, it's just different. She'll be tough, independent. But we need to make sure she knows there's more to the world than this mountain." "We will. When she's older, we'll take her places, show her towns and people and options." Mara moved to the next row. "But Daniel, there are worse ways to grow up than learning to work hard and appreciate what you have." She was right about that, too. May brought Hartwell for a visit, his first since Elena's birth. He brought supplies and news from the territorial capital and a carved wooden rattle that Elena immediately tried to eat. "She's beautiful," he said, watching the baby gum the rattle. "Looks like her mother." "Thank heaven for that," Daniel said. "How's Mara doing?" "Good. Tired, but good. Baby doesn't sleep much." "They never do at first. Gets better around 4 months." Hartwell accepted the coffee Mara poured. "There's talk in town about you two." "What kind of talk?" Daniel's guard went up automatically. "Good talk, mostly. About how you actually made it work. About the baby." Hartwell smiled. "You're a bit of a legend now. The man who couldn't keep a wife suddenly has a family. People like that story." "It's not a story. It's our life." "I know, but it gives people hope. If Daniel Cross can figure it out, maybe they can too." He sipped his coffee. "Also, the mining company folded. That legal case bankrupted them. They're selling off their claims." Daniel felt something unknot in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tight. "Good. Yeah, you won't have any more trouble from them." Hartwell looked around the cabin, at the new addition, the baby supplies, the life they'd built. "You did good, Daniel, both of you." After Hartwell left, Daniel and Mara sat on the porch while Elena napped inside. The sun was warm, the air smelled like pine and growing things, and for once the mountain was gentle. "You ever regret it?" Daniel asked. "Coming here?" "Sometimes I regret specific moments, like when I'm covered in baby vomit at 3 a.m, or when my back hurts from carrying her." Mara leaned against him. "But the whole thing, no, never. Even knowing how hard it would be? Especially knowing that, because it means we chose this. We fought for it. That makes it worth more." Daniel understood. The easy things in life, the things that came without struggle, they never stuck. They slipped away as quickly as they arrived. But what you built yourself, what you bled for and sacrificed for and refused to quit on, that became part of you. Permanent. Summer turned the mountain into something almost friendly. The garden thrived. The chickens multiplied. And Elena grew at a pace that seemed impossible. By July, she was rolling over. By August, she was sitting up. By September, she was trying to crawl and getting frustrated when her body wouldn't cooperate. "She's got your temper," Mara said, watching Elena yell at a toy she couldn't quite reach. "My temper?" "Yes. Angry when things don't go her way. That's not temper, that's determination." Again with the better publicity. But Mara picked up Elena and helped her reach the toy, and the baby's face lit up with triumph. They harvested in late September, bringing in potatoes and carrots and beans and squash. More than they needed, which meant they could trade at the trading post for things they couldn't grow. The root cellar was full, the shelves were stocked, and for the first time since Daniel had claimed this land, he wasn't worried about surviving winter. We're actually doing this, he said, surveying their supplies. Did you doubt we would? Every single day. Well, stop doubting. We're doing fine. They were doing better than fine. They were thriving in their own way. Not rich or comfortable by most standards, but stable, secure, together. October brought the first snow and Elena's first birthday planning. She wouldn't remember it, but Mara insisted it mattered anyway. First birthdays are important, she said, sewing a new dress for Elena from fabric she'd been saving. Important how? She's 1. She doesn't know what a birthday is. It's not for her. It's for us, to mark what we survived, what we built. Mara held up the tiny dress, checking the fit. 1 year ago, I was terrified, pregnant and scared and not sure we'd make it through. Now look at us. Daniel looked at their daughter, babbling to herself while playing with wooden blocks he'd carved, at their cabin, warm and solid and full of life, at Mara, beautiful and strong and exactly where she wanted to be. Yeah, he said, look at us. They celebrated Elena's birthday with Hartwell and 2 other homesteading families who'd traveled from neighboring claims. It was the most people their cabin had ever held, loud and chaotic and wonderful. Elena was overwhelmed and delighted, alternating between clinging to Mara and trying to grab everything the other children touched. She's social, one of the mothers commented. That's good. Up here, you need to like people when you find them. After everyone left, Daniel and Mara cleaned up, while Elena fell asleep mid-crawl, exhausted from excitement. That was nice, Mara said, having people here. Yeah, loud but nice. We should do it more often. Have people over. Let Elena see that the mountain doesn't mean being alone. Daniel thought about the 7 women who'd left because the isolation broke them, about how he'd assumed that was just how it had to be. You lived up here, you lived alone. But Mara had shown him different. You could be isolated and still build community. You could be remote and still connect. Okay, he said, we'll do it more. Winter settled in, but it felt different this year. The cabin was warmer with 3 people instead of 2. Elena was learning to walk, stumbling around holding onto furniture and laughing when she fell. She said her first word in December, "Da," and Daniel nearly cried. She said my name. She said a sound, Mara corrected, but she was smiling. Give her another month and she'll be saying real words. By January, Elena was walking on her own and getting into everything. She pulled herself up on the woodpile and sent logs rolling. She opened the stove door before Daniel could stop her and nearly burned herself. She grabbed the chicken feed and scattered it everywhere, delighting in the hens' chaos. She's going to kill herself, Daniel said, catching her before she toppled off the porch. She's exploring. It's normal. Normal is terrifying. Welcome to parenthood. February arrived, 2 years since Mara had stepped off that wagon into a blizzard. They marked the anniversary quietly, without fanfare, but Daniel thought about it. About the woman he'd been then, expecting nothing, prepared for failure. About how wrong he'd been. Thank you, he said that night while Elena slept between them. For what? For staying, for choosing this, for choosing me. Mara rolled to face him. I didn't just choose you, Daniel. I chose us. The life we could build, the family we could be. She touched his face. You gave me that too. The chance to be more than just someone surviving. They kissed over their sleeping daughter, and Daniel felt the last piece of ice around his heart finally melt. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of loss or failure or the mountain. He had something stronger than fear now. He had purpose. Spring came early that year, and with it, change. A surveyor passed through in March with news. The territorial government was planning a road through the area, connecting the mining camps to the trading posts. It would pass within 2 miles of their property. What does that mean? Mara asked. Means more people, more traffic, less isolation. The surveyor marked his map. Probably be finished in 2 years, maybe 3. After he left, Daniel and Mara stood looking at where the road would be. Does that bother you? Mara asked. That it won't be as isolated? Daniel thought about it. 2 years ago, he would have hated the idea. Now, with Elena toddling around the cabin and neighbors visiting and a life that extended beyond just survival, it felt different. No, he said. It means Elena will have an easier time getting to school when she's older. Means we'll have better access to supplies. Means this place might actually grow into something more than just a handful of stubborn homesteaders. You've really changed. So have you. Maybe we changed each other. Yeah, maybe we did. They planted an even bigger garden that spring, 3 times the original size, with fruit bushes Hartwell had sourced from somewhere. Elena helped, or thought she was helping, digging holes in random places and getting covered in mud. Mara let her make a mess, understanding that learning meant getting dirty. She's going to need siblings eventually, Mara said one evening, watching Elena play. Daniel looked at her. You want more children? Eventually. Not now, Elena's still a handful. But in a year or two, maybe. The idea didn't terrify him like it might have once. Instead, it felt right. A full house, multiple children, the chaos and noise and life that came with a real family. Okay, he said. In a year or two, we'll try again. Just like that? Just like that. Why not? We're good at this now. Mara laughed. We're adequate at this. Let's not oversell it. Fair enough. Summer brought prosperity. The garden produced more than they could eat or store. They traded the surplus for tools and fabric and things that made life easier. Daniel built a second coop for the expanding chicken population. Mara started teaching Elena words, both English and Spanish, giving her daughter the gift of both languages. In August, Elena spoke her first full sentence. Chickens are loud. Yes, they are, Daniel agreed, laughing. Yes, they are. By fall, the road construction had begun. They could hear the work crews sometimes, blasting rock 2 miles away. People started passing by more often, workers heading to the camps, traders following new routes. Some stopped to buy eggs or vegetables. Others just wanted water and conversation. The mountain was changing, opening up, becoming less of a fortress and more of a place where people could actually live. Does it feel like we're losing something? Mara asked, watching a crew pass by their property. Maybe, but we're gaining something too. Daniel bounced Elena on his hip. She's going to grow up in a different world than the one I came to. That's not bad. That's progress. You sound like you're making peace with it. I am. The mountain doesn't have to be about suffering and isolation. It can be about building something, being part of something. We proved that. In September, a young couple stopped by, lost and looking for directions. They were newly married, heading to a claim further up the mountain. They looked terrified and unprepared and so young that Daniel felt ancient by comparison. You'll be fine, he told them. It's hard, but you'll adapt. How do you know? The young man asked. Daniel gestured at the cabin, the garden, the chickens, Elena playing in the dirt. Because we did, and we didn't know what we were doing either. After they left, Mara came up beside him. You gave them hope. Maybe. Or maybe I just told them the truth, that it's possible if you're willing to work for it. Same thing, sometimes. October brought Elena's second birthday and news from Hartwell. The broker who'd arranged their marriage had died. Heart failure, sudden and final. His business was dissolving, his records scattered. End of an era, Hartwell said. No more mail-order brides in these parts. Daniel thought about the broker, the man who'd sent 7 women who couldn't handle the mountain, and finally one who could. He couldn't bring himself to mourn someone he'd never met and barely thought about, but he could acknowledge the strange role the man had played in his life. He gave me Mara, Daniel said. Whatever else he did wrong, he got that right. That winter was the mildest Daniel had experienced on the mountain. Not easy. Winters were never easy, but manageable. They had supplies. They had warmth. They had each other. Elena turned to and started asking questions about everything, driving them both crazy with her curiosity. Why is snow white? Why do chickens lay eggs? Why is the sky blue? Why is Papa's beard scratchy? I don't know, Daniel answered most of these. Ask your mother. Don't you dare, Mara said, but she was laughing. In January, they received a letter from Mara's brother in California. He'd married, had a son, wanted to know if they'd ever visit. Mara held the letter carefully, like it might dissolve. We could go, Daniel said, in spring, when the pass opens. Take Elena to meet her uncle and cousin. That's a long trip with a 2-year-old. So? We've done harder things. Mara looked at him. You'd really go? Leave the mountain? For a while, yeah. It'll be here when we get back. And Elena should know her family. He paused. Plus, I'd like to see the ocean. Never have. The ocean's 300 miles past where my brother lives. Then we'll go 300 miles past, make an adventure of it. They started planning. Not immediately, spring was months away, but planning nonetheless. Routes and supplies and what they'd do with the chickens and garden while they were gone. It gave them something to look forward to during the long winter nights. February came full circle, 3 years since Mara had arrived. They marked it properly this time, with a special meal and Hartwell visiting to watch Elena while they took a rare walk alone. 3 years, Mara said, looking out at the mountains. Feels like longer. In a good way or bad way? Good. Like we've lived a whole life in 3 years. She took his hand. I can't even remember who I was before this. Before you. Poor. Working yourself to death in Denver. I mean who I was inside. What I thought I wanted. What I thought I deserved. She turned to face him. I thought I deserved survival. A roof and food, and maybe some safety. I never thought I deserved happiness. And now? Now I know better. I deserve this. We deserve this. The hard work and the good harvests and the family we built, all of it. Daniel pulled her close, kissing her in the cold February air. We should get back. Hartwell probably needs rescuing from Elena. They did need to rescue Hartwell. Elena had convinced him to play tea party with her wooden blocks, and he looked desperately relieved when they returned. Your daughter, he said, is a tyrant. She gets it from her mother, Daniel said. From her mother? Mara protested. You're the one who... They argued playfully while Hartwell escaped, and Elena laughed at her parents' bickering, not understanding but enjoying it anyway. Spring brought new life. The garden sprouted early, the chickens laid prolifically, and Mara confirmed what they'd both suspected. She was pregnant again. Due in November, she thought, maybe December. You sure you want to travel to California? Daniel asked. We'll be back by July. Plenty of time. She rubbed her still flat stomach. Besides, I want Elena to meet her family before she has a sibling to compete with. They left in April, the three of them in a packed wagon, heading west toward California. The journey was harder than anticipated. Elena got sick twice, the wagon broke an axle, they got lost in Nevada and spent 3 days finding the right trail. But they made it, finally, to a small farm outside Sacramento, where Mara's brother greeted them with tears and laughter. You made it, he said, hugging Mara hard. I thought you'd never leave that mountain. We didn't leave. We're just visiting. Her brother looked at Daniel, sizing him up. You're the man who finally got my sister to stay put. She got herself to stay put. I just gave her a reason. Good answer. He shook Daniel's hand. Come meet my family. They spent a month in California, and it was good. Elena played with her cousin, Mara reconnected with her brother, and Daniel saw the ocean for the first time in his life. It was bigger than he'd imagined, louder, more powerful. It made the mountain seem small by comparison. But when it was time to leave, Daniel was ready. California was nice to visit, but it wasn't home. The mountain was home. They arrived back in June to find their cabin untouched, their garden growing wild but surviving. Hartwell had tended the chickens like he'd promised. Everything was as they'd left it, but somehow better for having been missed. Good to be back? Mara asked, surveying their land. Yeah, really good. They settled back into mountain life, but different now. They'd seen the world beyond, understood what they were choosing by staying. And they still chose it. That made it mean more. Summer passed in familiar rhythms. The garden thrived. Elena grew wilder and more confident, and Mara's pregnancy progressed smoothly. By October, she was showing clearly, and Elena was fascinated by her mother's growing belly. Baby in there? She'd ask, poking Mara's stomach. Yes. Your little brother or sister. Want sister. We'll see what we get. They got a boy, born in late November during a snowstorm, healthy and loud and demanding. They named him Samuel, like they'd discussed years ago. Elena was suspicious at first, unhappy about sharing attention, but within a week she'd decided he was acceptable. My baby, she announced to anyone who visited. Our baby, Mara corrected. My baby, Elena insisted. They were a family of 4 now. The cabin felt full, chaotic, alive in ways it never had when Daniel lived here alone. Sometimes it was too much. 2 children needing things at once, no privacy, noise at all hours. But Daniel wouldn't trade it for anything. This was what he'd been missing. Not just a wife or a partner, but a family. People who needed him and whom he needed back. People who made the hard days worth it and the good days better. Winter was brutal that year, the worst since Daniel had claimed the land. They lost half the chickens to a fox pack. The roof needed emergency repairs during a blizzard, and Samuel got sick enough to terrify them both before finally recovering. But they survived it together, each of them contributing what they could. Even Elena helped, bringing firewood 1 stick at a time, watching Samuel when Mara needed to cook, being braver than any 3-year-old should have to be. "She's going to be tough," Mara said, watching Elena march through snow that came up to her knees. Like her mother. Like both of us. Spring brought relief and the road's completion. Now there was regular traffic past their property, weekly supply wagons, monthly mail delivery, occasional travelers. The isolation that had driven away 7 women was gone, replaced by connection to the wider world. Daniel stood at the edge of his property one April morning, watching a supply wagon pass, and thought about how much had changed. The mountain hadn't changed. It was still brutal and beautiful and unforgiving. But he had changed. He'd learned that survival wasn't enough, that isolation wasn't strength, that needing people didn't make you weak. He'd learned, finally, how to build a life instead of just enduring one. "Papa!" Elena's voice called from the cabin. "Samuel's crying." "Coming!" He turned back toward the cabin, toward the noise and chaos and love waiting inside, toward the family that had taught him what it meant to truly live. 7 women had left him because the mountain was too hard, too isolated, too much. They'd been looking for something the mountain couldn't give them. But Mara hadn't been looking for easy. She'd been looking for real, for honest, for a partnership built on work and respect and shared purpose. And together, they'd built something that lasted. Not perfect. Nothing about their life was perfect. Elena was stubborn, and Samuel cried too much, and the chickens kept dying, and the winters were still brutal. But it was theirs. They'd fought for it, bled for it, chosen it every single day. That was what made it worth having. Daniel Cross walked back to his cabin, to his wife and his children, and the life they'd built together in the shadow of the Colorado mountains. He'd spent 8 years waiting for someone to stay. And when she finally did, she'd brought more than just herself. She'd brought hope and purpose, and a future he'd stopped believing was possible. The mountain was still there, still testing, still demanding. But Daniel wasn't alone anymore. He had Mara beside him, Elena and Samuel growing strong, and a life rich with everything that mattered. He'd survived the mountain, but more than that, he'd learned to belong to it, to make it home. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A place to belong, people to belong with, and the strength to keep choosing it even when things got hard. Daniel stepped through the cabin door, into the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of his life, and closed it behind him. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the mountain in white. Inside, his family waited. He was home.